My guest today has written a book about the 1918 pandemic, which devastated indigenous communities in Labrador. The book is called We All Expected to Die. It's certainly a book that resonates in this particular era. Her name is Budgell. She is a journalist, and it is my pleasure to welcome Anne to the program. Hi,
Well,
Anne.
it's great to be in a studio with you again, Karl.
Yes, it's been a while. So let's talk about the book, and first of all, I'd like to ask you about the Moravians, because the Moravian mission stations figure prominently in the story. Who are the Moravians, and what role did they play in the lives of the Innu and Inuit of Labrador?
None in the lives of the Innu at all. The Moravians are a Protestant reform group who, I guess, they were formed in the late 15th century in reaction to the excesses of the Roman Catholic Church. And they were in what was then the Czech Republic, but shifted over to Germany. And they were missionaries. They wanted to bring their message all around the world. They were in Greenland before they came to Labrador, so they actually spoke Inuktitut when they came to Labrador, the first ones, because they had learned it in Greenland. And they started establishing stations on the coast of Labrador. They had been given a grant of land by the Newfoundland governor, who did that because he wanted to have the Inuit settled into places where they would be controlled somewhat, so they wouldn't have interactions with the fishermen from Newfoundland who were going up there. So it was all, you know, in the service of allowing a fishery to go ahead and keeping these Inuit people in their places at these stations where the Moravians controlled who lived there. They had a monopoly on the trade. They imposed a new religion, if they could, if people accepted it, and most of them did. And they imposed a new culture, so they just moved in and took over and became the authority, really, on the north coast of Labrador.
Now, there were two vessels in particular, one the Sagona and the other called the Harmony. These vessels delivered goods to the Inuit of Labrador, or the indigenous communities, and passengers as well. It was a back and forth thing. They delivered to and they took stuff from there. Now, these vessels, it's pretty obvious, were responsible for delivering as well the deadly virus to these communities. Can you tell us something about them? Well,
the two vessels had different areas of the coast that they were responsible for. The Sagona was a vessel that was chartered by the government of Newfoundland to bring mail and freight to Labrador. The Harmony was owned by the Moravians, so it went to the northern communities. The Sagona didn't go to those communities. It didn't have to, because the Moravians took care of their own communities. There was some overlap. But the Harmony brought the flu to Labrador, because in the year 1918, the Harmony had already made 2 return trips to Labrador by October. On the 20th of October, it was in St. John's getting stocks and supplies and everything else for its last trip to Labrador. And at that time, the city of St. John's had flu. There was lots of flu. The hospitals were full, and it was a problem that the public health officer acknowledged. But the Harmony must have had a clean bill of health, because they were allowed to sail away and go to Labrador. The Sagona also, around that same time, went to Labrador, and it went to, the first place it brought the flu was to Sandwich Bay and to Cartwright. And then it went to Rigolette, and it brought flu there. The Harmony had a different course. The Harmony left St. John's and went all the way to Hebron in northern Labrador. And the reason the captain did that was because he was afraid if he started south to north and then came back down again, he might get stuck in ice. So he thought he'd go straight north and then just come south. And it would give him a little bit more time before the winter bad weather struck. So yes, it was the Harmony that brought flu to the Inuit, and the Sagona that brought flu to other people in Labrador.
Now, there's pretty strong evidence that one of the passengers on the Harmony had the flu.
Well, somebody had, because otherwise nobody would have caught the flu.
Yeah, but there are references in the book to people having said, witnesses having said that there was somebody on the ship who was ill.
The only people on the ship were crew members. There were no passengers.
Oh, I see.
There were about 20 crew members. And as I said, this vessel had a clean bill of health to leave St. John's. But that doesn't mean that they weren't carrying infection. They obviously were carrying infection. And when they got to Hebron, within 4 or 5 days, I think actually more like 6 or 7 days, people began to be sick. And the vessel left like the day before, people began to be sick. The thing about the flu, it's kind of like COVID. I mean, people can be asymptomatic.
Right.
And they can carry the virus. And there wasn't anybody sick. And I read the log of that ship. There was no notification, no nothing about anybody being sick on that ship. And I had the log for a good year and a half or more. And the captain sometimes wrote a note if somebody had a stomach ailment or a hernia. There were notes to this effect. So you would think if somebody was deathly sick or really ill with the flu, he might have made a note of it, but he didn't. And he also didn't make any note about warning anybody that anybody was sick.
Well, he did allow his crew to leave, at least on 2 occasions in 2 different communities, to attend dances.
Yeah, probably they had dances because the crew wanted to have dances.
Yeah.
But you know what, and I looked at that, trying to figure these dates out. By the time these dances happened, and I know the dates of the dances were either the 8th or the 9th of November, that ship had been gone from St. John's for nearly 3 weeks, 19 days. By then, there was no member of the crew who was still carrying infection, but what there would have been on board, probably, infected local people, infected Inuit. Because the vessel was going from Hebron to Okak. Somebody said, well, I want a ride down to Okak. Okay, come on with us. Come on, get on board. There were infected Inuit then at the dances. So the infection had passed now from the white men on the crew of the ship to the Inuit.
When the Inuit became ill, the Moravians blamed them for catching it. They said, well, you didn't listen to the warnings.
You ignored warnings,
This was not the first time
Yeah.
that they had blamed them for catching various diseases, was it?
This blaming business really upsets me.
Well, it's upsetting to read.
What are we doing this for? You know, you're blaming people for getting sick. Well, the reasons they blame them, they said, well, you obviously aren't praying enough, and you must be sinning, and God is punishing you, or you're dirty, or you're physically inferior. Over the years, through epidemics of measles, typhoid, smallpox, flu, earlier outbreaks of flu, the Moravians were always telling them that they were sinful, and this is a punishment from God, and if they weren't so sinful, they wouldn't be punished in this way with this illness. Doesn't that remind you of something? It reminded me of the AIDS outbreak.
Yes.
When people were told that they were sinful and this was God punishing them. Well, that's not the first time somebody's tried to blame people for being sick. And there's even been a few instances of it here in COVID, where people just instantly blame someone.
Right.
The person who went to the Call's funeral home, there was some blaming going on there.
Yes.
We shouldn't be doing that. Somebody got sick.
Yeah.
They didn't know they were sick.
Yeah. I found it remarkable how quickly the Inuit died. It seems like they would get sick, and then the next day they were, some people died in the middle of lighting a fire.
People
Was this
were
because
struggling.
they didn't have the kind of immunity that perhaps
Yes.
people from Newfoundland had?
Well, it would have been, they wouldn't have had as much immunity as people who were exposed to other viruses had. And because they lived in a part of the world that was locked in by ice for 8 months of the year, every year, they had not been exposed to the first wave of that flu that circulated earlier that year.
Right.
People in Newfoundland were exposed to it. People in the southern part of Labrador were exposed to it. People all around the world, many of them were exposed to it, but not people in that part of Labrador. And actually, I read a scientific paper that was done on that very topic. Isolated populations who were not exposed to the earlier wave of the flu suffered more and died in higher numbers. But Karl, I just want to stress that nowhere in the world was there a higher number of deaths a higher rate of death than in northern Labrador, where it was 70%
Yes.
of the people who died in Hebron and Okak. And that flu, and I had to look it up today to remind myself, that flu, the deadly wave, the second wave, killed 2.5% of the people it infected. Not 70% usually. And seasonal flu, the normal flu that we usually get, kills 0.1%. So this was a really, really deadly flu, but it was many, many times more deadly to the Inuit people and others who were not exposed to earlier viruses.
And these Moravian mission stations weren't terribly well equipped in terms of having medical supplies and people with medical training, were they?
Nowhere was in Labrador.
No. Dr. Harry Padden, who was situated in Labrador, he did what he could, and I think Dr. Wilfred Grenfell did something.
Grenfell did nothing.
Nothing?
He wasn't there.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about him too, because there was, from reading the book, there was definitely tension between Grenfell and his organization and the Moravians, right?
Well, we all know a lot about Grenfell because he wrote a lot of books about himself and his work. And he was out there on the lecture tour and giving talks in large halls where thousands of people would come and hear him. He was a real performer and a showman. And the Moravians thought that he hyped up his work in the North more than he should have, a disproportionate amount to actually the work that he did, because he never ever spent a winter in Labrador. He always talked about the Labrador as if he lived there when he went all the time, and that was the only place he ever was. Actually, he was based in St. Anthony, and he did a lot of good work all over the place, but he was never in Labrador in the wintertime, ever. And he was certainly not there during this flu outbreak. He knew nothing about it.
I think a lot of people would be absolutely gobsmacked to learn that, but
I didn't discover that. That's there on the record.
Because he is so very much identified with Labrador.
But that was his branding. I mean, if you look at books that he wrote, there's a picture of him, wearing what traditional costume people would wear in Labrador, holding snowshoes on the dog sled and all this. Now, people in Newfoundland did a lot of those same things, but he wanted to be identified with Labrador. It was a better branding. And you could get more money from donors if they thought you were up there, in the north, in the extreme north. I mean, he made it sound like he was up in the North Pole, for heaven's sakes. Yeah. Now, he was a great advertiser for himself. He was a terrific showman. And the Moravians were jealous of this. But also, he criticized them. He criticized them in letters to them and letters to the health authorities. Said, I don't know why the Moravians aren't doing this and aren't doing that, because he at least had a medical staff that he would bring to Labrador in the summers. And Dr. Harry Padden was a permanent resident of Labrador. He lived in central Labrador, so he was nowhere near the north coast during the flu outbreak. In fact, Padden was so sick, his wife, who was a nurse, and another nurse had to take care of him. He was so sick. But Grenfell was away. He was far, far away, and all they had on the north coast was a man named Asbo, Herman Asbo. They called him doctor. He wasn't a doctor. He had 1 year of medical training.
Why did it take so long for news of the disaster to reach the rest of the world?
100 years ago, on the coast of Labrador, the only telegraph station in operation in the wintertime was in Battle Harbour, which, as you know, is on the extreme southern end of Labrador. So if you're going to send a message from Hebron or Okak or Hopedale or Nain, somebody has to carry it overland on snowshoes or with a dog team all the way from there down to Battle Harbour. Now, once they got to Battle Harbour, they could send a telegram, and telegrams were sent. So the first word got out in March, I forget what date exactly, of 1919, because somebody brought word down to the telegraph operator. And that was when the colonial secretary in St. John's replied, and I went and found, I wondered, did anybody reply to these telegrams? And I found a telegram in the provincial archives dated the 22nd of March, 1919, from the colonial secretary back to the telegraph operator in Battle Harbour, who he'd been told that 340 Inuit had died. I don't know if he put the number on it, but hundreds had died. And what did he want to know, Karl? He wanted to know the names of any of the white settlers who had died, particularly Newfoundlanders. That's all he wanted to know. He didn't say, our hearts are breaking for you, what can we do for you? He just wanted to know if any white people had died and what their names were.
There was quite a bit of criticism, some criticism in the newspapers of the government for
specifically one newspaper, yeah.
Now, there's some incredible stories in the book, personal stories. Tell us about Martha Manziel, the little girl who was with her family at a campsite outside of Okok, and, well, she was the only survivor.
Yeah. The habit in the fall was to go to many different places outside of Okok. Some are on islands and some on the mainland of Labrador, but away from Okok because they were netting seals. I say hunting. They weren't hunting seals. They would put these big rope nets in the water and trap the seals. And they wanted these seals for their own food and for their dog food, right? So as many seals as they could kill, that was their job, to get out there. And Martha, little Martha, who was 7 years old, went with her grandparents, a little cousin of hers, and another woman to a place called Uliasuk, which is on the mainland of Labrador, not very far from Okok. And her grandparents and well, they'd all been exposed. They'd all been exposed to the flu in Okok when the ship came. And then they carried it with them to their camp. The older people all died. There was Martha left with her little cousin who was about 3 years old, and she couldn't take care of him. And I interviewed her years ago when Nigel Markham and I did the film, The Last Days of Okok, right? I interviewed her, and she said, I didn't know what to do. I was just a child myself. I didn't know what to do to take care of him. And he died also. In fact, he was torn up by dogs. She saw it happen. I mean, there were wild dogs, sled dogs there that hadn't been fed, and they ravaged the bodies, not only in these camps, but in the village itself. But this was, I think she must have gone with her family to that camp at around the 8th or 9th of November, because that was when the Harmony left. And people didn't go to their camps until the Harmony had left. And she wasn't rescued until the 6th of January. So this 7-year-old child survived for 2 months on her own.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just incredible. Now there was another child, Joshua Obed. He was 13.
Yes.
He was in Hebron.
Yes.
And he had to watch one by one as all of his family passed away, didn't he?
He got sick himself, and some of his recollections of it, which were written down, I never did meet him or interview him, but he was delirious, thinking about water, wanting water. Many people died of dehydration, I think, because there was nobody well enough to bring you a drink of water. You know, everybody was sick. But he survived. He managed to survive, 13-year-old boy. And you're right, he did see all these members of his family dying, parents, brothers, sister, cousins, neighbors, whatever. And because he was then one of the only able-bodied people left in the village, after things settled down a little bit, he had to help the missionaries. The few adult that were well were these missionary men, with rounding up the dead bodies, assembling the dead bodies, disposing of the dead bodies. They cut a hole in the ice in Hebron to get rid of the bodies. Killing dogs, because the dogs were marauding around the village and terrorizing everybody. So 13 years old, this is what he had to do.
And it's important to point out that when you talk about the dogs, you weren't talking about 5 or 6 dogs. There were hundreds of dogs, these sled dogs in these communities, correct?
That's right. And they had to keep some of them fed because this was their means of transportation.
Of course.
And they knew that when things settled down, they were going to have to send a message out to someone. And the only way to do that would be with dogs. So they had to keep a few dogs separate and keep them fed, which was a hard thing to do when you're struggling to keep people alive, take care of orphans and bury bodies and everything else. I mean, it was a nightmare.
Now, in the book, you quote from diaries and correspondence of various people, and some of this stuff is so heart-wrenching to read because many of these people were people who nursed the ill and dying. Some of them were ill themselves, but some real heroes in the book. Can you talk about some of those people?
I will, but I want to say though that I knew about some because, as you mentioned, they were written about. But everybody cared for everybody else.
Yes.
And it wasn't mentioned all the time who these people were or the things that they did, but everybody cared for everybody else. They had to. You had to bring wood, you had to bring water, you had to bring food. And some people did die because they didn't have heat and they didn't have water. I know that. They probably would have survived the flu if anybody had been well enough to take care of them.
Right.
But you know, there are some people that I think worth mentioning. We haven't talked much about the flu in Sandwich Bay, but in Cartwright, for instance, where Reverend Henry Gordon was, he was the Anglican priest there. There was Hayward Parsons from the Hudson's Bay Company and his wife Sybil Parsons, who was a trained nurse and had only graduated from the General Hospital 5 or 6 years earlier. And a man who was a fur trader from New York area named Edward Clark.
Right.
They formed a little team of people, and they had their duties every day. You know, they would go to this house and go to that house, make sure these people had wood, these people had water, get some soup into these people. What about these children? Their parents are dead. Put them in this house. Do this, do that. Okay, bury the bodies. Another funeral today, 2 more tomorrow, 5 next week. You know, they were on the go all the time, just struggling to keep the people alive who were sick and going to survive, and dispose of the bodies, to get them away, you know, get the infected bodies away and buried.
Now, there were quite a few orphans left after this disaster.
Yeah, north and south,
so what happened to all of these, parentless children?
Well, you know, in Sandwich Bay, Henry Gordon and Dr. Grenfell got involved in this. They raised a bunch of money to build a boarding school. It was essentially an orphanage/boarding school, and they shamed the Newfoundland government into giving them some money to underwrite, to help support the orphans there, as the Newfoundland government did for some orphanages here in Newfoundland. On the north coast, the Moravians just packed up all those children because I can't remember how many there were, and they brought them to people who said, we'll take a child, or we'll take a child. The children all went to, because I don't think any of them went to Hebron. Hebron continued to exist. Okak had to close because all the men had died, all the Inuit men had died. But the orphans from Okak went to Nain and Hopedale and Makovic, and little places around, little coves where people lived. They were placed with relatives if possible. If not, they were probably near enough to relatives to be placed there. But, you know, there were sad stories even out of that. I interviewed 2 women who were sisters, and they were separated. They were little girls, you know, like I think they were 7 and 9 years old. They survived the flu, and when the missionaries placed them in homes, they placed them far apart from each other, and they did not see each other again until they were young adults.
Wow.
Yeah, and one of them, Rosie Ford, said to me, that broke my heart.
I bet.
After her parents dying and everything else, then to be separated from her sister and her brother?
Yeah.
Yeah, really hard.
So, with all of the research that you've done, what is your assessment of the Moravians and what the work they did in Labrador?
Tough question, because you know they did do good things. You know, people were always pointing to the Inuit of Labrador and saying they're literate. You know, the Moravians have taught them how to read and write, and look at this, they've taught them how to play brass instruments and so on, and this is true, for instance, but they weren't allowed to play music other than church hymns. they weren't encouraged to read anything other than church tracts or the Bible. This education was to improve their Christianity, their spirituality in Christianity. It wasn't so that they could go off and read books and read newspapers and play or compose their own music or whatever. And their own spirituality had been shoved aside, and they were told that it was inferior and primitive. And their own music and singing, they were never encouraged to do that. That was gone, that was banished. So how do you judge a people who have come from afar, settled in this place, taken the land that belongs to those people, and it belongs to them again now, and impose their culture on them, force them into an economy that they knew nothing about before, encourage them to live in houses. Houses. I mean, they had sawed houses and they had igloos, and if things got dirty, they'd knock it down and go and build a clean one.
Right.
You know. The houses were not a good idea necessarily, and not with the shortage of building materials in Labrador and the shortage of fuel on the north coast of Labrador. If you're in a nice tight sawed house or an igloo, you can heat the place with hardly any fuel at all.
Yeah.
An old house made of planks is pretty cold in the winter in Hebron.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a tough question. And many people have struggled with this one, lots of academics who have written about this.
Well, the good news is that despite everything, they survived.
They did.
And they're here.
They did. 30% of them died. 30% of the Inuit people in Labrador died. And just imagine if that had happened in Newfoundland at the same time, it would have made headlines around the world.
Exactly. And thanks so much for telling us about your book. It is a fabulous work of journalism. Congratulations on it.
Oh, thank you, Karl.
We all expected to die from ICER, and I highly recommend it. Thanks again, Ann.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for this edition of Karl Wells Point to Point. Please join me again next time.